Hello everyone, and welcome to MOOCs by Design. This is a week-long webinar series offered by Penn State's Informational Technology Services Unit and is intended to discuss the 5 key phases of massive, open, online course creation. Over the course of this week, we're going to be featuring sessions devoted to planning, which happened on Monday, design, which happened on Tuesday, development today, delivery tomorrow, and finally evaluation on Friday. My name is Brad Zdenek. I'm with the Center for Online Innovation and Learning here at Penn State. I will be helping relay your questions to the presenters today. I have the honor of introducing them, and I'll also be your host for the next 90 minutes. There are a few pieces of housekeeping we have to get through before we get started. It's really important to us that we have an engaging presentation, an engaging session today. So we ask that if you have any questions whatsoever as we're going along, please go to the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, type in your questions, and I will relay those to the presenters when there's an opening for dialogue. Also, if you have a question that perhaps you're not comfortable asking in public, you want to be anonymous, you can also do that by hovering your mouse over my name, Brad Zdenek, on the left-hand side of the screen, and selecting Start Private Chat. That will open up a private chat box. You can ask me the question, and then I'll relay it to the presenters anonymously. Finally, if you're having any sort of technical issues whatsoever, feel free to ask for help in the chat box. You can also private chat Jim Salvaggio, whose name is also on the left-hand side, or myself, and we'll try to help as best we can. So, with that taken care of, we've already held our sessions on planning and design phases of MOOC, so today we're going to be continuing our discussion with a focus on development. Luckily, we have a team of experts with us here today. Leading the discussion is Megan Kohler, a member of the Teaching and Learning with Technology Instructional Design team and driving force behind the development of MOOCs by Design. Megan is joined today by Claire Geisegem, who is a producer-director at WPSU, Penn State Public Media. Hannah Williams, a multimedia specialist within Penn State's Educational Technology Services Unit, and Audrey Romano, a web strategist and designer for the Teaching and Learning with Technology Studio. So with our introductions out of the way, I'll hand the reins off to Megan to get us started. Megan?
Thanks, Brad. Hello, everyone. We're very excited that you're joining us today. We have a lot of great information to share with you about the development process. And we're going to get things started by sharing some more basic information in the beginning, but we'll ramp up the discussion pretty quickly. That said, I'm going to start us off with 3 key concepts today: content, enabling your team, and implementation considerations. Content. It's the driving force behind the entire creation process. Everything we do as a development team relies on that content, which is why it's so important to go through that design phase. It provides you with the opportunity to make as many revisions as you need, because once you get to the development portion of the process, it's extremely difficult to go back and make revisions to that information. Another important reason for having the content finalized prior to engaging in the development process is due to the fact that faculty, instructional designers, graphic designers, etc., we all come to this process with different knowledge and skill sets. And the reality is that, oh, sorry, that was right. The reality is we're all headed in the same direction, but we have different ideas about how to get there. Communication can be challenging because of those differences, and the content can help resolve that. It serves as the one thing everyone on the team can use as a common focal point during this process. The unfortunate thing about the content being such a critical component to this process, though, is that the entire responsibility for content creation falls on the shoulders of one person, the faculty member. Now, in Monday's discussion, there was an attendee who asked a question about strategies for getting faculty members on board with this process and getting them wanting to write the content and to be engaged in this. And so I'm going to share with you 3 key strategies that I use for getting faculty on board. The first and most important is to listen. This isn't a new concept, but because of our need to get information quickly these days, as designers, we can sometimes forget that we're not all about the project. We can't be. We have to focus on the faculty members, because the faculty members are going to be investing a significant amount of time into creating this content. And the reality is that they might not see anything tangible for several weeks. So taking the time to really listen to them, their ideas, concerns, expectations, and just as importantly, their hopes for this project is really, that's all just as important as the information that they're going to be creating. The second is also not a new concept, but just as important. The customer is always right. This can be a very difficult item to negotiate. As designers, we have strategies and methods for creating online courses, but we can't allow those processes to seem like they're barriers to the faculty members. And this concept is all about trying to get the faculty member as close to their goal as possible while working with those strategies and methodologies. The last key strategy that I use is knowing when to let go. If a faculty member really feels very passionate about some aspect of the course, be willing to concede to some degree. It really is their course and they need to feel pleased with the end result. The second topic I'm going to talk to you about today is enabling your team. In addition to utilizing the content as a common element for the development of the course, you can also use it for rapid prototyping. In fact, I highly recommend it. It's a great way to help the entire team work through the process to identify pain points or areas that don't work properly. It's also best to do this as soon as possible to ensure you have adequate time to address any issues. This is also a great way to solidify your process. Rapid prototyping is a great way for keeping your faculty motivated as well. The first time they see that finished video or that finished website, it's kind of like Christmas morning. You can just see the excitement on their faces. The image that you're looking at now is a page from the Epidemics MOOC. Another unique element of massive open online courses is that you can have many people involved. And this screenshot shows you just how many people were involved in some way with the Epidemics MOOC. And when you have a project such as this that requires you to communicate with a large group of people, technology can end up being your best friend. The tools we used in this instance consisted of Yammer, which was our primary communication mechanism for instructional designers to instructional designers, as well as instructional designers to administrators. And as you can see from the screenshot, up in the upper left-hand corner, we had 8 faculty working on the project, and we relied primarily on Google Docs, which was great because I could place important information in the main document, and everyone knew that that was the place to go to obtain details pertaining to the project. The next piece of technology that we used was Box.com, and in a lot of ways, this was our saving grace. Without this, we would not have been able to make the Epidemics MOOC happen at all. Box.com provided us with about 50 gigabytes of storage. It allowed us to use the structure in the space in the best manner possible for our workflow, considering that we had so many people involved. And in addition, I'm going to show you another slide here. It allowed us to streamline our communication and notification processes. So this is another screenshot in which you can see the dialogue that occurred for specifically this animation. We can see who sent it, the individuals that were notified, the date and time at which they were notified, and how quickly the other team member responded to that notification. The third and final topic that I'm going to discuss today is implementation considerations. When you create any type of online course, many of you already know that you should avoid using copyrighted materials. But what do you do when you're the one creating materials that can be easily downloaded and shared beyond the original course space? Well, the first thing you should do is check the contract that you have with the MOOC platform you've signed on to. Penn State is with Coursera. Their contract states that ownership resides with the faculty member. However, Penn State policy indicates that ownership resides with the institution. In our case, Penn State policy overrides the faculty agreement with Coursera. And as a result, our faculty need to seek guidance from their administrators about how to use a Creative Commons licensing for the materials that are created. Fortunately, in this case, we were able to assign a Creative Commons license to all of the videos, and we were able to ensure that that aligned with the deans and the university's view of how those materials should be used. Creative Commons is not a fail-safe mechanism for maintaining control over your resources, but it does give you some additional layer of protection by outlining how others should use your materials. Another important item for you to pay close attention to is the platform's update schedule. If you know that the updates are going to be released, try to access the course space as soon as possible to see if anything has been impacted. Coursera released an update halfway through the Epidemics offering, and the update made all of our pages disappear for the administrators. We couldn't access anything to continue building out the course. Fortunately, Coursera has excellent customer support, and they were able to get things back for us pretty quickly, but I was admittedly a little nervous until things reappeared. And the final point I will leave you with today is to document everything. In epidemics, we had a few situations in which individuals were shuffled in and out of the project, and having everything documented is one of the best ways that you can ensure individuals are getting correct and up-to-date information on the project. So that concludes my section on instructional design in the development phase. Are there any questions?
One of the questions that came up related to the conversational component within Box.com. I had another question related to Box. Did you run into any issues with versioning, with individuals saving files at the same time and conflicting copies within Box? I know that in my experience, we've run into that very often where you have a document that kind of is right on that line between what Google Docs would be best for and what Box would be best for, and sometimes you run into issues there. Did you run into that? How did you deal with versioning issues?
Fortunately, Box.com is great at managing that type of thing. We did not run into any versioning controls at all, or any versioning issues at all. Actually, I might be able to jump back to that screenshot because I saw that there was another question here about, I believe it was this slide, if I'm seeing this correctly. So Laura asked the question, was that notification screenshot from Box.com or another product? So Laura, this is a screenshot from Box.com. So in this slide, you can see how we have our naming structure in place here with the individual titles listed directly behind the sort of weekly code that we assigned. But then here, when you actually click on that file, this is the dialogue that you see underneath it. They do color it differently, and I'm not quite sure why they do that, probably just for a visual differentiation, but it is from the same product. And
Penn State has an institutional rollout of Box.com. What are there free options for Box? What would other institutions need to do in order to use Box?
There are free options for Box.com. However, I believe that the amount of storage that you get is rather restricted. With Penn State, due to our license, as I mentioned, we had 50 gigabytes available to us. I believe if you are signing up for the free version, you only get about 2 gigabytes. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Claire.
Okay, thank you very much, Megan. It's good to be here today. I'm going to be talking about the video components for your online course. Just remember back in your school days when your teacher brought in a video to watch instead of giving a lecture. Sometimes the video would be pretty engaging, but usually it was just an excuse for everyone to either sleep or slack off. So, of course, as everyone knows, online education is different. When you design videos for a credit course, people have to watch the videos to get the content. But for a MOOC, no one is going to force the students to watch. So how do you get them to? The quality of the videos are key. So that is where your video production team comes in. The biggest point that I'm going to want to make in this presentation is that video cannot be an afterthought. There are 3 basic phases to film and video, and that's pre-production, the planning, the production itself, which involves the filming, and the post-production, which is editing. So of these 3, I believe that pre-production is the most important, as it is obviously the planning stage. So bringing your video team into the conversation as early as possible will not only add to the overall quality of your project, but it will save you lots of headaches throughout the way. The small decisions that you make early on can have a big effect on your process, from how the content plays together to how it fits with your budget and your schedule. And these are the questions that you need to think about before the video process can begin, which is how much total video content will be in the course, how will the content be broken down, and what will the runtime be of each segment. And will the production occur in one day or over the course of multiple days? Of course, with the amount of your production, obviously one day is going to cost a significant amount less than over the course of multiple days. And that would also impact your setup time as well. And these questions will help refine your production needs and help you to think about how your video content fits into your overall course. One of the biggest things to think about here is edit points. And what are edit points? Put simply, they give you an opportunity to cover a cut in the film, so to speak. This may not seem very important, but when your instructor is, delivering the content and they're 90% of the way through his or her talk, and they cough on the last line, you're going to be extremely happy if you don't need to ask them to go back to the beginning, but instead you can find the closest edit point, like perhaps a paragraph, and then just cut from there. A natural way to hide edits in an educational video, like a MOOC, is to use full-page graphics or slides like these. But if your content doesn't lend itself to this, you can also hide edits by using multiple camera angles. Depending on your budget and setup, this can be done either by using multiple cameras or by recording your instructor at multiple angles or focal lengths. With the 2-camera setup, you're recording into 2 separate cameras, each with a different angle, and it gives you more options to choose from. Usually a medium shot like you see above, and a close-up or even a profile shot like we've done before. So like I said, these are 2 options. And just to give you an example, let's say in one paragraph in your script, they stumble right in the middle of it. Having 2 cameras allows you to use one camera for the first half of that paragraph and then cut over that stumble to the second camera. So to the viewer, it looks seamless. Again, all of these considerations impact every phase of video production, budget, schedule, setup, so they need to be given due diligence. While it may seem like a lot to consider, these items essentially boil down into 3 questions. Who is on camera, or how many people? What's their comfort level in front of the camera? This will impact your setup and the length of the segments. Where is it at? Is this in a real space or in a studio? And how are they going to be delivering the content? Are they going to be delivering it in a script, or are they going to improvise and just deliver it naturally, or will they be interviewed? So to focus on the who, this will impact your setup and therefore the equipment resources that you will need. If you have a single instructor talking to the camera, that's going to be a very different setup from the multiple instructors talking to each other and being covered with multiple cameras. And just to note, if you're going to have more than 1 or 2 people, I would recommend doing more than 1 camera. That way we can cut to a close-up of each individual as they talk, and it won't be so overwhelming for the viewer. It breaks up nicely, and I think it's much easier to watch, kind of like a television show. And like the who, the where will help refine your overall equipment and production needs. Essentially, you have 2 options. A real space or a studio. The studio can be set with chairs and a background or on a plain backdrop, either a white or really whatever color you prefer. Both options have their goods and their bads, and it really depends on how the content needs to be delivered. Try not to do something because it looks cool. Think about why you would need to be in a real space. Is there something that the viewer needs to see in the field, such as a scientist showing us something in a lab or at a site? You can also think about the comfort level of your instructor. The studio can be a more private setting. It's more controlled, but it can also be very intimidating. There's a dark room. There's bright lights. When watching a studio setup, the viewer doesn't typically take into account of what goes on behind the camera, but it's usually a small space with a lot of bright lights, and once you're underneath them, it can be a bit overwhelming for the first time. But try to be flexible with your instructors. You may have a great script, but if the instructor can't deliver it, you might need to think of alternative options. Instructors usually do great with improvising, but for timing and editing purposes, a script might be easier for you. And what I find is that instructors deliver scripted content better when it's in their own voice. Usually when someone else is writing something for you, it's an adjustment to get used to the tone. So if you try to bring in your faculty as soon as possible, I think that would make them feel a lot more comfortable with their delivery. And what makes the most sense for the type of content you're trying to convey, and this will help you get the best performance out of your instructor. Should they talk directly to the camera, either improvised or scripted, or be prompted by an interviewer? With straight to the camera, this can be difficult because talking to the camera doesn't feel very natural to the presenter, but I think it's a nice way to connect with students from a distance. Some instructors can go hours without a script, but others need something to read. There's been a few instructors that I've come across in the past that, they could stand in front of the camera under the lights for 3 hours and not miss a beat, but others might need the guidance of a script. So one note, if you're scripting, the way you write to read is not the same way that you write to speak. Consider the script taken from Penn State's Epidemics MOOC and how you would read the number in blue. Now, imagine reading that at a conversational pace as the camera's rolling. The best way to catch potential problems like this is to have instructors read, preferably out loud, as much as possible before production. Not only does this help, proofread, it gets them comfortable with the script, and the more comfortable they are, the easier it will be in production. I've heard of instructors reading the night. It usually helps the night before if they read maybe 2 or 3 times even. That makes the world of difference as opposed to getting in front of the camera under the lights for the first time. It may take about a half hour or so until they really feel comfortable. But one note: if you want to go the other route and use an interview, you need to ask how the answers will be given in context if you don't see or hear the interviewer. Are you going to use text prompts? Are you going to try to cross-dissolve to hide the edits, which doesn't always look very pretty? Or are you interspersing their answers with other footage like you would see presented in a documentary? You also have the option of showing the interviewer on screen, but that would add a second camera. Whatever you choose will depend on the content of your course, but you need to have thought through it so that you don't end up with a chunk of footage that you can't use. And I really love hearing interviews in online courses because it adds a pretty remarkable storytelling element too. So no matter how you choose to present your content, you want the instructors presenting it to look their best. So for wardrobe, the bright solid colors, especially jewel tones, tend to look best on camera. But just take into account not all of these colors look the best on everyone. I know that if you have more red in your hair, sometimes, especially if you're on a white background, you might want to avoid red or pink in your shirt. Just things to take into consideration. You also want to avoid tight prints like herringbone, polka dots, pinstripes. Those actually tend to dance a little bit on screen and can be pretty jarring. Solid black or white is actually not a great option either. White and black tend to wash out. And you also have to think about your background. If you're shooting on a white backdrop and you have a white shirt, it's not going to end well. And if your instructor's not sure, they can always bring multiple options. And when in doubt, a light blue Oxford shirt is always a safe choice. And I know a lot of faculty and instructors, they tend to get a little nervous with how they're going to look on camera, and especially with HD cameras. The term that's thrown around with HD is unforgiving, but I don't like to think of it that way. It's people look really bright when they're in front of the camera. So what we do is we have a translucent powder that we put on them, to take some of the shine away, and it's really you can't even really notice it. So you also want to have them avoid logos, and your audio person will love you if you have the instructor avoid noisy jewelry. And if they wear a sturdy material or jacket, that will support their microphone. Like if your instructor is wearing a shift dress, maybe have them wear a belt or a jacket so that they can clip the transmitter onto something. That will make things much easier. So this just about concludes this segment, but I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts. A common question I get is, how much time do I allow for recording? This depends, but a rule of thumb is about 2.5 to 3 times the amount of the total runtime of the script. People also want to know how long the editing will take. This is more specific to each course's individual content and the complexity of the edit. Chopping off beginning and end versus adding in multiple outside video components, but You can usually save yourself time in post-production by investing more time in pre-production. That's usually our philosophy. Never have, just this thought, oh, we'll just fix it in post-production. More problems tend to arise with that. So you're going to spend the time one way or another, either up front in pre-production or at the end in production. But the former is usually easier, and it's more cost-effective too. And so the moral of the story takes us back to one simple point. Video can't be an afterthought. Bring in your team as early as possible. They're there to help you, and they'll be sure that you create a really great product. So with that, are there any questions?
Claire, one of the questions that I had has to do with the pluses and minuses of the script versus the improvisational aspect. And I know that in my experiences with MOOCs, often you can clearly tell which approach was done. All other things being equal, a charismatic presenter, all other things being equal, are there really pluses or minuses to either approach within the MOOC environment?
To be honest, I think what I find is that scripts, you never really have a problem at least establishing some sort of script, whether it's an outline that that the instructor can reference. At least there's a skeleton that you could sort of follow. With improvising, it really just depends on the comfort level of your instructor. If your instructor is nervous being in front of the camera, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult for improvising. And also with improvising, you have to watch, you have to think about how you're going to edit it too. When you have a script, that makes the pre-production process, a lot easier in terms of, imagining how you're going to edit this, planning the edit points, and like I said, just giving you like a rubric to work from. But if you're in production and you decide to go off script a little bit, there can always be flexibility for that. So.
Does interview somewhat split the difference there, where it provides some structure but also room for the improvisation?
Yeah.
I know one of the issues with improvisation is that what is supposed to be a 5-minute segment often turns into a 10 or a 15-minute. That's difficult to edit down.
Right.
Is interviewing perhaps a middle point there, a compromise?
Yeah, I would say, interviewing, it depends on who you're interviewing. You can get someone who's very brief, or you can get someone who, could really give you hours and hours of footage. So it really depends on what you want to extract from the interview. And like I said, the interview adds a storytelling component as well, which I think there's always something to be taken away from that. So yeah, it really depends. When you have an interview, it's almost like someone setting clay in front of you, and you could just sort of mold it to whatever you want it to be, whether it's the hard content itself, or a perspectives element, or a storytelling piece. So yeah, it's really up to you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so now I will hand it over to Hannah, who's going to discuss multimedia development.
Thank you, Claire. As a graphics artist, MOOCs provide a fairly rich environment to develop multimedia. You've heard from Claire, who gave a nice presentation on video development. Within MOOCs, you typically tend to see static images or video, but there's fundamentally no reason why you can't have educational games or some form of programming simulation or other interface, any form of multimedia literally that helps support the educational mission. One of the MOOCs that I worked on, as you might have heard from Annie and Matt on Monday, was the Epidemics MOOC, which had the highest rate of hours applied to it for the development of animated video. I consider it to be an extremely effective way of delivering educational content, but it's also really labor intensive. So I'm going to walk a little bit through that process. Some of what I'm going to talk about will apply to static image development, but I also want to be able to talk with people about where bottlenecks exist in the development of multimedia. So the easiest place to start with this stuff is sort of with an economy of scale. I have a screenshot here of Dr. Peter Hudson alongside some assets that were produced or drawn by my colleague Nate Kling. When I use the term asset, I'm literally sort of generically saying that we're talking about a digital file with the right to use it. Assets, in our case, tend to be hand-drawn images or handcrafted animations. They could also be audio files, video files, PDFs, anything of that nature. So to give you a little bit of a tour of sort of what we're looking at before we've even left the gate, this particular video that the screen capture is from was 6 minutes and 8 seconds long. It had 32 assets. 5 of them were animations, and 27 of them were still illustrations. Now, I can tell you that to have only 5 animations inside of a video, that's actually a pretty low number for us. But even with that being said, it took 20 hours. It took Nate Kling, rather, 20 hours to put this together. If we scale that up, we had 61 videos in an 8-week course that needed to be animated. That's 280 minutes of just raw video footage. The average video was 4 minutes and 45 seconds in length, but I can tell you that the longest video that we had was a little over 9 minutes. If we just assume that there are 30 assets per video that need to be included per the storyboards, and that's a raw assumption. I know one of our most detailed animation had 110 assets in it. That scales to 1,830 assets that need to be created for that 280 minutes of video. Real time, we spent 1,843 hours generating video animation, images, and assets. For those of you that like math, that's 46 weeks of solid 40-hour-a-week work. People talk about where are bottlenecks in putting things together for MOOCs in terms of development. This could easily be one of them. The first thing I would say is please make sure that you have more than one multimedia specialist even working on this stuff. In our case, we had 3, but it's still, when you divide that up, it's still an enormous amount of work, and it takes a lot of planning. So how are you going to create 1,800 assets? Well, hopefully you don't. If we assume that we need 1,830 assets, realistically, I would say we probably created about 800. One of the most valuable things that you can do when you have a graphics person associated with your team in MOOC development, and it doesn't even matter if it's about creating animated video, is to sit down and allow that graphics person to look at all of the scripts and the contents and determine what images need to be produced. In the case of animated video, and due to the nature of the content that we were dealing with epidemics, we had a lot of concepts that were being repeated. Now that's a huge benefit to us. We know that we're talking about viral transmission, for example, so we need a picture of a virus. We know that we're talking about malaria. Well, we happen to have a picture of a mosquito here. So there's a way to sort of reduce, reuse, and recycle images as much as possible. Something that I think is also really important is that where I recognize that not everybody's going to be able to sit and have hand-drawn images for their content, we have scenarios where you might want to consider using an image resource like Shutterstock. And where that gets important is where you have a situation where you're kind of sort of balancing general productivity with the timeline and with milestones. Within that space, though, there are times when maybe you don't want to be using Shutterstock, and that starts getting into visual styles. I've put together, for just the sake of conversation here, a minimalist style guide here that we used in some generic sense within the Epidemics MOOC. This is strictly for demonstration purposes. It's a bit of information about what kind of fonts we're using, how we're styling those fonts for different use cases. The other thing that's really important is because we have 3 illustrators working on these things, and we pulled in a few other illustrators,
you have to recognize that Penn State is not Disney. So we don't all have the same illustration capabilities. We all function a little differently. There are ways to kind of homogenize that and reduce noticeable differences in how people are producing work. One way is to deal with color usage. So in part, we can say, all right, with the picture of the baby here, we have anybody who's infected with a disease, please always use this color of green. Anybody who's been recovered from a disease, use this color of blue. If somebody comes down with measles, here's the color the spot should be. The other thing that helps homogenize these things is setting up ground rules for how people should illustrate. So on the right-hand side, we talk about, please basically always use the same brush size and brush shape and 100% black in this example. The other thing, and I recognize this, and Audrey, who will be speaking after me, she also has a keen awareness of this. Style guides sometimes happen after a project has occurred, though I can tell you if you are dealing with fairly labor-intensive graphic infrastructures like we had with the Epidemics MOOC, it helps to have a style guide up front, because if you find out that your timeline is being pushed too hard and you need to bring other graphics people on board, these kind of ground rules will help set the stage for getting them on board as quickly as possible. I'm going to take a quick little detour here before I talk about sort of video and animation processes and just mention something about cultural considerations. In one of the earlier presentations, it might have been Annie and Matt's on Monday, there was kind of discussion about the fact that, at least for Penn State with its MOOCs, we found a large percentage of people that were coming from other parts of the country that were engaging in taking these MOOCs. So just be aware of that fact. At a really simple level, I could honestly probably talk for an hour about cultural considerations with image development and with even website structuring, but I will just simply say avoid stereotyping, avoid colloquialisms, idioms, be really strategic about your color usage. I know Audrey will talk about some of that later, but specifically one of the best things that you can do is just, because MOOCs are a team sport, involve your other colleagues as much as possible to reduce scenarios where content might inadvertently be offensive or confusing or cause any form of concern. So that's kind of just a really easy thing. Just keep in your mind. You could go nuts depending on the type of content that you're delivering within your MOOC, making sure that you've crossed all of your cultural P's and Q's, as it were. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my presentation kind of talking about the phases of the video development, and some part of you might think, well, why? This is honestly the space where if there's not enough of an understanding of how this process works, or where, again, the bottlenecks can occur, you can end up with budgets that run absolutely wild, and that's a place that you don't want to be in. So at the high level, the three phases of video development are the pre-production, the production, and the post-production. That's fairly straightforward. In our case, and I think this is a safe bet for other teams, though there might be some low statistical confidence interval on this, we're dealing with video development that have faculty, instructional designers, graphic designers, and the video production team involved in almost all of the steps. So let's start with the pre-production. We have what I consider a serial process. There's script development and there's storyboard development. So let's start with script development, because that has to happen before the storyboard development. A faculty member is developing the scripts, and the instructional designers are actively engaged in reviewing the scripts, providing suggestions, improvements, tightening up the content, etc. There are edits that occur, and we reach a milestone where the faculty member has revised the script and we have something that's finalized. At that point in time, that script is being handed over to, in our case, Claire of our world, where the video production team is converting that script for a teleprompter and getting it ready so that we can actually produce the video. Storyboard development. For those of you that don't know, storyboards are basically a form of animation plan. They were originally concocted by Walt Disney in the 1930s. And, you know, in his case, Disney is obviously a little more visually enchanting than the things that we were producing in the Epidemics MOOC. But you're literally dealing with frames of animation that are determining how a character is moving through space or how you're delivering the content in time. While we were not literally putting individual drawn frames of content, we actually worked from Google Doc in some cases, and there were notes kind of stating what imagery should appear when. And that kind of low-tech solution for storyboarding actually was very effective for us. So, you know, if you're going down this route, don't be afraid to use what you might consider massive notes to do storyboard development. So at any rate, once the scripts are completed, not beforehand, the faculty instructional designers and the graphic designers are working together to create the storyboards. This is really the first time where the graphic designers are coming on board, and it's an important time because the faculty and the instructional designers will have ideas about how to visually represent content, but I know in the case of the Epidemics MOOC, there were certainly things that I perhaps didn't know exactly how to draw, or it was perhaps a little bit too complicated. There might have been simpler ways to accomplish the same task. So it's nice to be involved with that up front before any work is actually being done. Again, we have some simple reviewing of the storyboard, suggestions for improvements, and then we have finalized storyboards. From that point, that's kind of where we hit production. And production has a parallel process here. Asset development happens at the same time as a video shoot does. So from the perspective of the asset development, we're really at this point taking those finalized storyboards and we're starting to work through the space of, okay, now that we have all the storyboards, what are the recurring themes, if you will? How many places are we dealing with viruses that we can just make one virus and everybody can use the same throughout? You're also just dealing with starting to draw at this point, in addition to locating visual aspects of things, so using your Shutterstock.com accounts and other things like that. The other thing that definitely happens with working with faculty, especially in scientific arenas, is they're going to start handing over charts and graphs out of publications and other items that they've perhaps published, but you're going to need to make sure that you can locate all of that information and be able to recreate it in a way that's going to be copyright friendly. So at the same time, the graphic designers are busy with this. The video production team is also very busy with the faculty. So they're taking those finalized scripts. The faculty are rehearsing this stuff, hopefully, because as Claire mentioned, it improves the quality of the final product. The video production team records, is actually shooting everything, and the rough cut footage from this is then handed over to the graphic designers to begin the animation. So that's kind of where production ends, and post-production starts, and you might look at this and think, well, why is animation development and post-production? The reason we put animation development and post-production is because at this point, all of the key elements are actually generated. We're merely manipulating already existing content at this point. Here again, we have a serial process where the animation development happens before the final video production. So in the animation development, the graphic designers like myself are using the rough cut footage to generate the animation. So in this case, I'm just simply making sure that as I'm walking through the script, I'm hearing the audio file and seeing the faculty member physically, on my screen inside my video development software, and I'm placing the animations or the images where they need to be in terms of the video and its individual time frames. Now you've noticed I've added a new icon here, a construction cone. Since faculty instructional designers review animations and provide feedback, this is probably in this entire process the #1 area where your budget can completely get out of control if things are not being monitored. What we found is that there is a need to make sure that everybody who's reviewing the video content at this point in time truly understands what their requirements are in terms of reviewing the animations. So in this case, the faculty member needs to make sure that they are comfortable with all the images that are being presented, that there aren't any spelling errors, that that they have imagery in all of the correct places. All of that needs to happen at this first place, because if it doesn't, you can find yourself going through multiple iterations of review. And that can be deeply time consuming, especially when you're working on a really large project like this. So once you get past that point, the graphic designers revise the animation, and then faculty and the instructional designers sign off on the animation. So we have a completed animation at this point. This is where we hit the final video production. The graphic designers will then take the animation. We've cut out the rough cut footage. We're just literally handing the animation over at this point, and that gets merged by the video production team with the very beautiful color-corrected, perfect video. They make a final version of that for the faculty to review. The faculty members review that, provide feedback. They sign off on the video, and at this point in time, we've hit a good milestone where we have sort of a final product that is ready to go to whatever your platform is. I have a note about closed captioning here. If for some reason you are handling your own closed captioning, do so when the video is completed. If you're working with Coursera, for example, make sure you touch base with your platform in advance to find out how they go about doing this, how much time they need to be able to put this together. And remember that from the earlier sessions that the captioning is important not only from the standpoint that it's an accessibility issue, but a lot of people who English may not be their native language will work through translating the transcript so that they can learn from it. Some people just like the transcript to just be able to read it as opposed to watching the videos, etc. So it's a good thing that you want to make sure that you have. So here's the scary part of this, is that despite everybody working hard to review things, and I'm certainly guilty of this, which is why I have this slide here, but what happens if you get to the end of this whole process and you have a video that you think is ready to be uploaded to your platform, and suddenly you realize that you've spelled measels wrong? And the sad fact of the matter is you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the animation development process. That means that the graphic designer has to open up the original animation file. You got to sit there, alter that. Then the instructional designers and the faculty members need to make sure again that everything looks good, and we continue to work through this process. So those kind of mistakes then can be costly, because now that involves the video production team again, et cetera, et cetera. So again, where I had the little construction cone, just try to make sure everybody's working in reviewing things as much as possible early on in that process, because it will save you a lot of time and money. So I want to end by saying that you can do a lot of heavy lifting with some multimedia development for your MOOCs. A lot of neat things can be accomplished, but it also requires a level of planning. And I think if it's possible for everybody to get past the planning and sort of the regimented nature of producing this stuff, you can actually have a lot of fun with it, and it can be an extremely rewarding experience.
Thanks, Hannah. One of the questions I had as you're going through was, you were talking about some of the standardization on the style sheet. Is there any standardization at the institutional level? Does Penn State have any guidelines for typography or animation style or even graphic style? Or are there pluses or minuses to that kind of approach?
The question has been asked a little bit, and Megan and Audrey will probably want to chime in with this as well. There's a general feeling that a university like Penn State, or any of the other universities that the attendees are from, there are general high-level style guides typically that apply. In our case, how to use the Penn State shield, what's the color for the Penn State blue, that kind of stuff. But within forms of online education, it gets hard to standardize a look and feel for some of this stuff, just simply because needs of each of the individual courses are very, very different. Do you guys want to add anything?
No, you've got it spot on.
All right. Well, with that being said, that's actually probably a really nice lead-in for Audrey. Audrey's going to be talking about delivering content for the web, and specifically, our experiences with working with the Coursera platform.
Thanks, Hannah. So here's the point where you're going to put it all together and get it out on the web using your MOOC platform of choice. And while this phase comes last, it too can't be an afterthought. It may be as simple as copying and pasting content into the platform, which you certainly can do. But if you want to add a layer of design that can improve the user experience and make it easier for them to learn, as well as make it stand out, it can pay off big. Your course as it lives on the web is what your user interacts with, so it sets an impression they may carry through with each course they choose to take or not take from your institution. So I'm going to talk about some things you should keep in mind when adding visual design to your online course. You probably already have a project plan or scope for your MOOC, covering video, covering development of the content. And you'll want to make sure you've covered the bases on what resources you're going to need to publish it online. Things like which MOOC platform are you going to be delivering it on? Because each platform may provide you with a number of different tools that may have different functionality and limitations for design. Take things into consideration like learning curves, because it may wind up being a bottleneck if you only have one person who has these web skills. In your scope, you want to clearly state what your expectations are for that visual design of your content and describe how your team plans to meet those expectations. So much like your wardrobe, you're going to have to figure out where you're going to put all your content and how to make it easy to find. If you aren't sure where to start, you can look at other people's MOOCs, what worked for other people who are maybe delivering similar types of content. Find examples that might work for your content based on more usability, functionality reasons rather than your personal taste. Focus on simplicity, the KISS, keep it short and simple rule. Learn to express your message in fewer words. Your words will be more impactful and it will be more likely to get read and be understood. The time people commit to reading on the web is different compared to reading a printed manuscript, so brevity is going to be your friend. The use of styling and visual elements to emphasize certain points within your content improves learning. We're talking about using headers and ample white space, images, to give your content some breathing room, to draw the user through without losing or confusing them in the clutter. So consider what information architecture and navigation you're going to use, how your content is organized, and how your users navigate between the information and the activities and back again should be really carefully considered. Again, consider what platform you have that you're building on and what that provides you in terms of navigation. So in our case, Coursera courses have a fixed left navigation sidebar. And it can include special pages that list out all of the quizzes and all of the videos for all of the weeks. But it's not really user-friendly if you link to this kind of special page from within your content, because your user is hopping from one, a reading assignment maybe to this videos page for the entire course, and then can't remember which one they need to watch, perhaps, or how to get back to where they came from, or what assignment they need to do next. Here are 4 examples from different courses on Coursera showing some of that labeling and organization they chose for their navigation sidebar. For the Epidemics MOOC, which is all the way on the right, we looked at what others were doing to improve navigation and decided that listing the weekly assignments right in the navigation itself gave the user the quickest access to them. Many MOOCs posted their weekly assignments onto their announcements page, which functions like a blog. So every time they updated that blog, their users would get that weekly assignment. But our navigation was customized to make those week assignments more noticeable by breaking it out into weekly landing pages. And each week's landing page gave the student everything they needed for that week right on one page, where they could watch the videos in page rather than referring off to that full list of videos page. But you'll notice in example number 3, they consolidated the weekly class landing pages into one page, minimizing some of that clutter that can happen in your navigation. Which way is better? It's something that you might not know unless you do some testing with some real users. Wireframing your content per page can really help figure out how it all comes together before you try to build it. You have content outline and you've thought about your navigation, so now we wireframe that and see how it all translates to a web page, how it all fits on that page. So wireframes can focus on the different types of content, information you have, the user calls to action, the priorities of the information and the functions, and it connects that information architecture to the visual design that comes later and shows the relationships between each page of a site so that you can examine how the functionality is really going to work. You can test out some of that navigation within your page and along with the navigation bar itself. So with your wireframe, you'll have ideas of where to place media. Images and your videos should also be consistent with the theme of your content throughout your content. Even if they aren't crucial to the content, you might consider using them to help break up the text in a document, like on this screenshot from apple.com. Images used correctly makes that content more easily scannable. So you can chunk your content, which is a common practice for instructional designers, but it's also something you can do for the web. Visuals in your content can significantly help different types of learners absorb your information, and they are what people react to the quickest. So use them wisely. Too much of it and you can overload users. Too little and you can reduce their ability to engage. Also keep in mind your writing style, the mood and tone. It should be for the web. So try using bullet points and short phrases to convey your information wherever possible. I mentioned user calls to action, and what that is typically a linked image or text that urges the visitor to do something. You want to make them stand out. They're frequently in button form, and they use active verbs, not just click here, but relevant to what the user needs to do. Things like sign up, get involved, download this, or play video. Ask the question, who is your audience and what do they need to do? And in the case of a MOOC, do they need to digest a lot of information and then take a quiz and discuss in a forum? You want to establish these tasks clearly up front for your users, establish those expectations so that the user knows why they're here and what they need to do. And so, for example, here's a page from the Epidemics MOOC. We've chunked the content with headers to separate the different areas of text. We have the expectations listed close to the top, what you will have learned this week, and the videos have buttons to play the video. So that information is clear. So now you'll want to plan for consistent use of design throughout your course. Consistency in the use of visual elements improves usability. It translates right away as a theme, and that theme can have meaning. Not every course at your institution needs to look exactly the same, but some consistent traits used throughout the course itself translates as having a cohesiveness. So try to be consistent across all your content materials, colors, fonts, images, and videos, as Hannah mentioned about before. One of the tools designers use to keep track and communicate the consistency of visual elements is a style guide. It's a document that can be shared with the entire team to refer to when building pages and other elements requiring design. So in general, most style guides will include guidelines for colors, typography, buttons, something called a grid system, and other user interface patterns. Things like how do tables look, how do lists look. I'm going to cover examples of each of these style guide elements so that you can see how it relates to the web and how we use it in the Epidemics MOOC in particular. So I might get a little technical at times, but keep in mind that Megan, the instructional designer who admits to not being a coding expert here, was able to use HTML and CSS that I designed for the Epidemics MOOC and repeat them on each of the content pages. Again, the style guide could really help in this way if the work is being split among a team, because they can look at what they're trying to do on a web page and refer to that guide for the bits of code or colors and fonts and understand when and why to use it. So let's start by looking at the Epidemics MOOC again in reference to color. Some of the colors were there by default as part of our Penn State University styles, such as blue links, body text color, and then navigation and background colors. But based on the Epidemics course logo, we chose 2 shades of red to use as part of the content palette. We chose red because of what it signifies. It's probably the most powerful color for expressing moods and feelings. It is also the greatest attention-grabbing color in its brightest shades, and evokes strong emotions like danger, passion, fire, anger, that sort of thing. But as Hannah mentioned, cultural implications should be considered when choosing colors, especially considering the diversity of your audience. So for example, we were notified by a Penn State colleague that in his culture, South African, red means stop and don't go there. To be sensitive to who the audience is, we limited the use of that on the user calls to action, the play buttons on the videos in particular, because we do want people to go there, click there, and watch the video. But we kept red for the headers because the information does refer to dangerous things. I mean, it's epidemics, right? So typography. You're most likely familiar with using headers when creating your content online. Headers are used to denote different sections of your content, usually consisting of related paragraphs and other HTML elements. And they typically range from an H1 to an H6 and should be styled in a clear hierarchy, like largest to smallest. You can stick with the default style for headers that your platform provides, or you can consider adding different fonts and manipulate font sizes and weights, depending on what you want to do there with that. You may not realize it, but typography adds to the user experience just as much as images can, and it can be used to create visual interest and engage the user. Typography also helps break up content in more easily scannable chunks. To improve accessibility in particular, you should use headers as section headings to indicate information hierarchy and not just for that visual formatting. So with the Epidemics MOOC, we overrode the default page header that Coursera has, which was kind of small and easily ignored, and added a more dramatic font to add visual emphasis to the weekly topic and its significance. We paired this serif font called Abrial Text, which has this contemporary design aesthetic and has a strong presence on the page, and paired that with the default Helvetica Neue. I also used color and weight and italics in the headers and subheaders to emphasize the new page and section headings and some of the active language relating to topic description. And this also helped, again, to make those pages a little bit more scannable. Another area you want to define in your style guide are buttons, because they're tied to that call to action. We use this type of style of button in the Epidemics MOOC for our video play buttons. And for the web familiar people in the audience, these button styles are actually part of the Bootstrap CSS framework, which I'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. Coursera is built upon Bootstrap, which allows us to use some of the Bootstrap styles for things like buttons, tables, and lists. And then here's how the buttons looked in page on the Epidemics MOOC. For things like tables, we again relied on the default Coursera Bootstrap styles, but you do need to be familiar with Bootstrap CSS to know how to use it so that you can use the right class in your code to refer to those styles in the style sheets. So in your style guide, you might show that snippet of code that needs to be used and a visual of how that code will look so that your team knows when to use them in their content building. So for a quick example, here's a schedule outline from a random Coursera course. And here's one from our Epidemics MOOC using CSS. We use this table styles for Epidemics to make the content more scannable, more readable, so the users should more quickly see what they're going to be doing for each week. And then versus this, which is a perfectly fine schedule online, but it's just a little harder to scan through. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper here for a second. So if you're feeling a little lost here, don't feel bad. I just want to introduce you to some of the things that we've used that you can keep in mind. Again, it really helps to have a web designer you can work with, but if you're into learning something new that you can do with HTML, this is really cool, actually. So a typical problem you might face is that you've got tons of content that you may want to put on a page, but you want to break it up on a page into different size vertical columns, but you don't know how to quickly and easily get all that done. The solution is a grid system. A grid system is built around 3 key elements: containers, rows, and columns in HTML. Again, because Coursera is built on Bootstrap, you can use some simple HTML to take advantage of the grid system. In this case, it uses 12 columns, and it has responsive capabilities where the columns become fluid and stack vertically, ensuring proper proportions for key screen resolutions and mobile devices. So an example of that is looking at the Epidemics MOOC videos again. We use the grid system here to lay out those videos across the page instead of filing them one by one vertically. And we also used it with just the text on the credits page. And it just kind of breaks that information into a cleaner organization. So what is this Bootstrap thing I keep talking about? Bootstrap is a CSS framework that can be used to build websites because it helps get a site quickly started and creates consistency and a visual baseline. So, naturally, something like Coursera, where they're trying to get an app built quickly, might use Bootstrap to define that visual baseline. It helps solve common typography, browser, and mobile compatibility problems so people can focus on the content and design of their application. Bootstrap provides in its website all kinds of good things like a grid system, style typography, and other UI components like buttons and tables like we've shown. So if you're really comfortable with HTML and CSS, or you have a web designer at your disposal, Bootstrap can really be a helpful tool. But I fully admit that it can be a little overwhelming for someone who's less familiar with web design, so you don't really have to get into it if you don't need to. But you can go to their website, and it provides HTML code snippets. Essentially, it's its own online style guide that you could copy right into your pages, particularly in Coursera. I'm not sure what some of the other platforms use, but in our experience, we were able to take advantage of that. But just to note, Coursera doesn't provide any documentation themselves or tools for content building to use any of these styles. It's something that we had to kind of dig into to find out ourselves. And even knowing what Bootstrap is and that Coursera is built upon it, it's really not an obvious thing to a standard user. But even if you're using another MOOC platform that isn't built on Bootstrap, as long as it allows you to use style sheets, you can consider adding those Bootstrap style CSS yourself if you like what it provides. So it is a good tool for web designers in the end. So now that we've gone through all the parts of a style guide, how do we put it into effect on a website? Well, we use style sheets. Style sheets are what web designers use to customize the look of a website and override the default styles of a site. And the purpose of all this is to create a more unique and usable course layout. So taking what we've defined in the style guide, we can preset and override web page elements using the style sheet to automatically match what we've already outlined in the style guide. So that every time you use a particular header tag, for example, it will just automatically use your chosen font, color, and size. Here's just a quick glimpse into a particular challenge when using Coursera. While you do have the ability to use style sheets, it's kind of not a straightforward or documented process. For us, I have to be logged into Coursera, and I have to upload the style sheet file into what's called the asset administration section. And then once it's uploaded, I have to click this embed link on the right and note the URL to that particular file. And unfortunately, there's no global way to integrate that style sheet throughout the entire course. So you will have to manually add this bit of code to the top of every single page that you create to call that style sheet into action. That also means that any of those special pages that Coursera auto-generates, like the pages listing all of your videos or quizzes, they don't let you add custom HTML, so you won't be able to make use of the style sheet. And this is really important because if your visual design is radically different from some of the basic look and feel of Coursera, you might run into a consistency issue. Also, you can't edit the style sheet from it within the platform like you can with the content of the page. So, if you're tweaking styles on the fly, this can be, it really just doesn't work. You need to make the changes to the style sheet locally on your computer and then delete and replace that file on Coursera. Okay, now we're past that complex stuff. We've covered planning, organizing your content for the web, and creating consistency using a style guide. So once all is said and done, it's time to test. If nothing else, conduct user testing. The biggest usability commandment by Steve Krug, who wrote Don't Make Me Think, is don't make users think. You want them to think about your content, to learn, but not about how to use the website. Make the website understandable on an intuitive level. Everything we've touched upon, choosing the right navigation, organizing your content, setting user expectations, making calls to action noticeable, and the visual design, it all comes into play here. Users should know what they need to do and where they need to go next instinctively. And the usability testing doesn't need to be this big complicated thing. Just grab a couple random people who have nothing to do with the development of your MOOC and have them run through a week's assignment before making it live. Listen to the feedback from existing and past students. It's the best way to ensure the quality of what you've created. And so this is the basic process designers use. But they can work for you too because they can overlap a lot with a lot of the things you might already use when you're designing your content. So again, consult and collaborate with a designer if possible to refine and customize your look and feel and optimize for usability. If you don't have the resources, keep it simple. Your content is the key. So as long as your content is digestible and uncluttered and the user tasks are clear, the design doesn't have to be flashy to be effective. And if you keep these things in mind when you apply your content to the web, you'll be able to create the highest quality MOOC to represent the quality and value of that education. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Audrey. One of the questions that came to my mind as you were presenting, but quite honestly, I think I'd like to hear from a number of you because this applies across the board. Many things that have been talked about so far today are just quote-unquote best practices that we've learned for over years with online course development. Is there anything unique in each one of your experiences to MOOCs? Something that as you started working on MOOCs, you thought, well, this is different. This is different than what we've been doing in online course development. Or is it simply a matter of stakes, the fact that rather than 50 people, 100 people coming into the course, you have literally thousands coming in at once, so that high stakes environment?
Well, I can tackle that first. So from an instructional design perspective, a lot of what we do comes in sort of in the design discussion that Kate and Gary had yesterday. So the scale is definitely an issue when you're working with MOOCs, but I think it also has to do with something that I touched on in my presentation about the number of people that are involved in this. So all of a sudden you're not necessarily working with just one faculty member to create this thing. We had a team of 8 faculty members working to develop content. We had 10 GAs that were going into the discussion forums and interacting, and so because of that, we needed to have weekly debriefs just to make sure that everyone was on the same page and that if there were any issues that arose, how we were going to go about handling that. Trolling is an issue in MOOCs, and so you have to have a united approach in terms of how you're going to address that, and that's not something you typically have in your residential courses. So that's from an instructional design perspective, and that's just one quick thing.
One of the things I will add, because Matt and Annie touched on this in Monday's presentation. For Penn State, it gave us an opportunity to touch a greater portion of the worldwide community. It affects how culturally we think about delivering content to people in different parts of the world, what things would be of interest to them, etc. And that was another really big difference that we see with the massive open online courses and the residential courses.
And that also speaks nicely to the issue of branding, where you're creating something that, faculty members who don't have a lot of resources, and so they set up their webcam and they create these videos. That's fantastic if those are the resources that's all that's available to you. But for an institution like Penn State, We have a huge community of instructional designers here, and not every institution has that. Penn State is one of the few universities that really employs instructional designers and utilizes them quite heavily. And so when you have those resources, you obviously want to put your best foot forward. So that's why we didn't set up our own video studio here in one of our conference rooms. We reached out to WPSU and actually contracted with them to develop these high-quality, professional-looking videos. That's why we had a team of 3 graphic designers working on all of these things. It's about that brand, because everything that you put out there is a representation of your institution, and it provides you with a lot of great opportunities to potentially bring in new learners, but also just to sort of be like, this is what we think online education is about. This is what we think is a good example of online education. So it's that worldview as well. I'm reinforcing your point.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I think is cool as well, while Audrey was giving her presentation, I was sort of stirring the chat window over here, asking people some questions, and it's sort of neat to see that there's a general feeling that there are people that are both getting on board with putting MOOCs together and other forms of online education, I assume, as well as people that have done many of them. While we're sharing our experiences right now, it'll be really cool to see if any of you are ever in a place where you can share your experiences so that we can have that cross-pollination. So I was grateful to those of you that chimed in and responded to my inquiries. It was neat to see.
Related to that, the fact that in the chat we see that some of our attendees today are in the beginning stages, mulling this over and just beginning their efforts in the MOOC world. Can anyone speak to the onboarding process to the MOOC platform? We use Coursera here at Penn State, but again, thinking of the stakes, the number of people that are going to be seeing this course, what is that orientation process like? When Audrey was walking through, how to upload the CSS, and I'm very familiar with that within a normal web environment, but this is very different.
Yeah.
And there's a learning curve there. So what was that process like? What's the onboarding process like for coming onto a MOOC platform? Or what was it in your experiences?
I think because Penn State kind of jumped into it right away, we had a lot of different teams who were starting to develop a MOOC in their own colleges. So I think everybody between instructional designers and perhaps web professionals who were poking around in Coursera and looking through the help forums and trying to see where the boundaries are and what the limitations are and where people, what could we do with this platform. I think it was that kind of group effort that made some of those details come to light and have us each experiment in what's doable, especially in terms of like how to style in there. I think most people using Coursera probably just go with the default styles, which is perfectly fine, as I said. But I thought, in this case, we had some really creative stuff going on, so there was this potential to kind of deliver it more creatively too. And so I, got crazy with the colors and the fonts and things like that. But I really think, content strategy is really important, and it is hard to read pages and pages of information straight off a website. So I think there is value, at least, in considering how that content is arranged and how you navigate through it more than things like fonts and colors. But it is that team effort into kind of exploring the platform in and of itself. I know that we were looking into edX and other things like that and trying to compare the features and whatnot. I didn't get a chance to look at edX in terms of web design, but I would be curious to see how some of those, compare in terms of styling or content layout, things like that.
I think from an instructional design standpoint, so I've been working at Penn State developing online courses for 8 years, and the unit that I was in prior to this, we had our own homegrown system. So I was very fortunate in that respect to be able to see what it's like to have something that you start out with that might not work the way that you want it to, but then really be involved in that process to help inform the tool and how it moves forward. And I find it very interesting that that's sort of a parallel experience with the Coursera platform. I think Matt stated in his presentation that, MOOC platforms right now are kind of like stepping backwards a little bit. And that's not intended to be mean. It's just, we've done a lot with sort of our homegrown platforms at varying institutions. There's a lot of different options that are out there. And then to see this thing that's coming out, and it's handling massive amounts of people, but it doesn't have some of the functionality that we're used to. One of the first things I did was I sat down and I started looking through it. And I turned to Audrey and I was like, okay, we're customizing all of this. But there's pros with that, but there's also a lot of cons with that too. I had mentioned that, some of the updates, because we had customized the site ourselves, things disappeared and we couldn't access them. But at the same time, you really want to make the learner's experience as good as it possibly can be. And so I felt that it was crucial for us to go and restructure that learning space so that it was something that students could come to and get their entire week's worth of activities on a single page and know what is expected of them at a glance, rather than sort of filtering through several different folders or several different locations to find information. So, I think that that's always sort of the key to any new platform, is finding out how you can make it usable for your learners.
Thanks. And we have, I believe, one more question coming in. So while we're waiting for that, I did have a question. I believe, Hannah, you were talking about the transcript generation in the platform, and you kind of mentioned one of the things you need to think about is how long that takes. How long does it take? Or in your experience, how long does it take?
Megan would probably be the person to answer this question. I mean, we found them to be enormously accommodating. Megan, do you want to just answer that? Because that's really, you were the one that was dealing with that the most.
Sure. So the one thing that I will say is this. If your platform offers closed captioning, go in and check the documentation and find out what their recommended time frame is and plan for that. Coursera on their platform lists that it takes anywhere from 7 to 14 days. Now that said, that was not our experience. There were times that I could submit something and within a few hours I had the transcript back. Other times I had to wait several days. And so in our discussions with them, as it turns out, what happens is when you request a video to be transcribed, it goes into a queue. And they work from top down. So depending on how many other videos are submitted about that time, you could get it back within an hour, or you could have to wait, 7 to 14 days. It all depends on what their workload is and how many people they have available to work on that at that point in time.
Thanks. So Laura asked in the chat, have you seen any differences in video view rates with different layouts? And I guess perhaps Megan or Audrey, this may be for you. For example, does showing a thumbnail and a summary with the thumbnail on the pathogens course yield more views than just a text link?
I mean, we haven't done, I'm not sure that we can get actual event statistics on a single Coursera course page, but it's definitely something that we are able to do on a standard website. I think that from my experience, if you set the user expectation in a manner where you give them a preview thumbnail and a summary of what they're going to watch, that kind of sets their expectation of what this is going to entail rather than just a link. Like that videos page where it just lists all those video links for all the weeks to come out. I just feel like that doesn't really give the user much, it doesn't really invite the user the same way as giving them that preview. Anytime, that's why YouTube provides you embed links to give you that preview and be able to play it in page, and it doesn't pop, you don't necessarily even have to pop into YouTube. You can just watch it on whatever web page that content is embedded on, and I think that has kind of become the standard, the expectation from the user point of view. And visuals are always, going to capture users' attention versus text.
I guess the other thing that I would say in conjunction to that is that with the epidemics MOOC, we had 61 videos. I'm not sure that any of the other Penn State MOOCs could even compare in terms of that amount of video multimedia. So we haven't even had the opportunity to experiment with that. But I would agree with what Audrey is saying, that I think having those thumbnails is a fundamental user experience. If that process didn't work, the YouTubes of the world wouldn't have that as the related videos and all that other stuff. So my guess would be that it's effective, but we haven't had a raw chance to experiment with that yet.
I think that's a great question to ask Bart
on Friday.
Yeah, ask Bart that question on Friday.
I was actually just going to mention that one of the things we'll talk about on Friday is the fact that there's a large amount of analytics that come out of these courses, so large that at times it's difficult to suss out individual questions or ideas such as this. And Bart, Bart Purcell, who's our individual who deals with the analytics for our MOOC courses, is going to be presenting during the evaluation phase of MOOCs by Design on Friday. So that would be a great question to ask him, or he may even just be covering it in his presentation. So with that, well, I do see that there are possibly a few questions coming in. You guys like to come in right at the last minute.
Go, Tom, go, right back.
Throughout Hannah's presentation, you talked about a few of the bottlenecks that you ran into. Were there any other bottlenecks beyond just the video production, video design, that any of you experienced in the MOOC? And actually, Megan, perhaps as having the 1,000-yard view of the MOOC process, MOOC design process, you might have a better idea. Where were the bottlenecks that stood out for you? Where were the points in MOOC development that maybe you didn't anticipate taking as long as they did?
Oh boy. Well, as Hannah said, there can be multiple bottlenecks.
Some of it even in terms of content generation.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it kind of goes back to sort of the point that I touched on earlier about, you really need to get faculty buy-in on this because we are coming at this from different perspectives. And if a faculty member has never been through the course design process before, it can be very daunting because they just feel like they're churning out all this content and nothing's happening. But the reality is that there's all of this stuff happening behind the scenes. But yet it's difficult to get to that point where you have something tangible to show them. And that's why I said, it's kind of like waking up or having them wake up and see this on Christmas morning. Like their eyes just light up and you can see how excited that they can get about this.
If somebody on Monday in Monday's session asked, does Penn State, if you will, just generically require that before a MOOC is put together, do the faculty members that are involved in that, do they have to have had some previous online learning development experience with their content? And Andy sort of stated, well, no, but gosh, it really helps because there was a great graph that Matt or Annie had presented, and it sort of showed it was a line chart, and it showed people being kind of excited at the beginning. Oh, we're going to do something really neat, and then the middle section of the chart is the line starts coming down a little bit because it's the realization that, gosh, this is a lot of work, and this is harder than I was expecting, and I don't really know how this is going to come together. I don't know how video works. I remember at one point in time having to explain to a couple of the faculty members how animation works and comparing it to making flipbooks when you're a little kid that you can kind of fly through. But what's interesting is that kind of as Megan described, it's like hitting Christmas. There's a point where the happiness factor increases exponentially because there's a prototype to show for all of this work. And in the case of the academics, we had 8 faculty that Megan was working with and coordinating and what have you, and none of them had any online learning experience prior to doing this. So that in itself, in terms of content generation and helping people sort of come up to speed and having shared knowledge, that can be a bottleneck because that's a fairly daunting project management challenge on some level.
Yeah. So in the interest of full disclosure here, yeah, I think Hannah and I have been sort of gingerly working around this, but I'll just go ahead and put it out there. So when we started working on the epidemics MOOC, the lead faculty member had very specific perceptions as to how the animation process was going to work. And that being, that he had never been through a course design experience before. And so his perception was that the process was very similar to the RSA animations, which if you've ever seen the RSA animations before, it's basically there's a person talking, it's an audio clip, and as they're talking through the narration, you see a hand just drawing all of this information. And so the faculty member's perception was that that's how these animations were created. You simply played the audio clip, and you would just sit there and draw the graphics, and then if you have a 5-minute video clip, it takes you 5 minutes to create that animation. And,
And it doesn't include any erasing or any of that stuff that exists in a normal media development.
And we were kind of like, well, so there's sort of that Hollywood element that plays into this. There's a lot of work that they're doing behind the scenes that you're not seeing. And he was like, no, I've seen them do this. This is how they do this process. And so as a result, he was kind of just like, well, no, I'm not worried about the content. I know that we can get the content done. I just need you to start showing me some of these animations. And we're like, we can't do that. We need the content. So, it's again, kind of getting back to that, we're coming at this from all different perspectives, and so you have to sort of negotiate that. And unfortunately, we lost a considerable amount of time from the beginning of the project in trying to negotiate that. But in the end, we have amazing graphic designers like Hannah on board who could just go in and just pull this stuff together in an amazingly fast manner and still have it look really clean and professional. So we were very fortunate.
Thank you. And with that, I think that we are finished for the day. So I want to put out a large thank you to Megan, to Hannah, to Audrey, to Claire, and most importantly to our participants today. Thank you for joining us. Today was our session on development. Tomorrow you can join us at 3 o'clock for a session on delivery, opening up that course and having people flood in, which is a very intimidating process, and we'll talk through that. And then on Friday, as I mentioned before, we will have a session on evaluation where we can talk about some of the analytics related to MOOCs. Thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of the team, and we hope to see you tomorrow.